Return of the Prodigy by T.E. Grau. It was over the complimentary anniversary cake for two that Gary sprang the news. Just minutes before, the Valcamps were wrapping up another predictably silent ceremonial dinner at the Drover, where they had memorialized each anniversary for the last 34 years. The occasion was once again ushered in with identical iceberg salads, butter-grilled Omaha steaks, and long looks around the room over smeared cocktail rims, searching for familiar faces and forgotten gossip. But this night was different. This was the 35th, and after enduring exactly 12,775 days of intermittent harping on the fact that he had never taken his wife Gladys on a honeymoon following their traditional Lutheran wedding, Gary decided to man up and do the right thing, if only to find a little goddamn peace. You see, Gary was a frugal man, but not inappropriately so, considering the circumstances of his upbringing. Born with the sluggish blood of German stock on the cusp of the Platte River Valley, he wore his innate thriftiness as a badge of honor. It was the right thing to do. It was the Nebraska thing to do. Gladys, a former Kansas City socialite and theater actress of little renown, was quite the opposite, and although she loved her husband as a historian loves a bygone civilization, she always chafed at his chintzy ways. But the heart doesn't deal out fairly, so she suffered his shallow pockets mostly in wifely silence. Mostly. That would be her story, anyway. But on this night, Gary bit the bullet. He didn't like the taste, mixed as it was with the floury chocolate he was trying to work out of his bridge work, but he understood that men sometimes do things they don't want to do. The burden of the masculine and all that jazz. Gary finished his beam and water, placed his hands on the tablecloth, and made the pronouncement. Gladys was ecstatic, spilling a bit of her Mai Tai as she leapt with surprising speed across the table and planted a series of awkwardly received kisses on her husband. Hawaii, right? It was more a declaration than a question. Gary, long since accustomed to her odd fascination with Don Ho, tiki parties, and all things Polynesian, just smiled. "You'll see," he said, with one of his patented ex-jock winks that first wooed Gladys all those years ago. Gladys brushed and hugged him tight. Gary inhaled her Avon perfume that always smelled like Raid on her skin. "I love you," she whispered. Gary grunted and patted her arm. Gladys released, clapped her hands like a schoolgirl, drawing much-needed attention from the room, and trundled off to the bathroom, squealing happily through tears. Gary sat back, exhaled, and ordered another drink. When they arrived home, Gladys hustled to her laptop to purchase a whole new wardrobe of Novo Chic Cabanaware from QVC Online, while Gary logged onto his desktop, searching out affordable vacation options in Micronesia. Hawaii wasn't even an option. Fiji and Tahiti were out, obviously. Money-sucking tourist traps, lousy with shirtless newlyweds and Euro trash stuffing their uncut manhoods into Speedos. Murderous. Guam would be fitting in a way as a former Navy man, but he knew Gladys would see right through this and nag him into suicidal thoughts he'd long since put behind him. Clicking through various slick tourist sites, Gary came upon a promo page for Wallakea, a flyspeck peeking up from the water nearly equidistant between the Philippines and Easter Island, which sported a cozy resort nestled upon a dreamy, secluded island of exotic black sand beaches. Cozy, Gary grumbled at the thought of such forced intimacy. Worse, a backwater like this probably wouldn't even serve proper liquor. But before he could move on, his gaze was caught by the most affordable vacation value in the Pacific, highlighted inside a flashing gold star. Nice. These islanders were speaking Gary's language and doing it with class. Cross-checking a few reputable news sites, he discovered that Wallakea had experienced a spate of underreported ecological incidents that had nearly ruined the local fishing economy late last year. Gary nodded with satisfaction. If he had to hand over his hard-earned greenbacks to foreigners, might as well do a little charity work amongst the godless zipperheads while he was at it. Two birds with one stone, moonlighting as a Christian imperative. Gary now had to sell Wallachia to his wife. He whipped up a batch of Malibu rum runners and presented them to Gladys as she stood in front of the mirror, going way easy on the condition of her pear-shaped body while babbling about various crash diets that all the actors do. Gary kept the cocktails flowing, and after less than half an hour his wife was on board. A belated honeymoon on Wallachia. Let the angels sing. The creaky South Pac Airlines 737 circled the tiny mountainous island a few times, shedding altitude like a bad habit as it began a tight, controlled corkscrew. Gary, who hated flying with a white-hot passion normally reserved for illegal immigrants and tax heights, steadied himself as his stomach rose into his throat. He glanced, nervously, past Gladys, down on the lush greenery below, which seemed to chew its way up to the lip of the pitch-black beach, as if wanting to retake the land from the sea. From above, Wallachia looked like a sooty History Channel graphic of the islands of the Pacific Theater in World War II. Guadalcanal, Palau, Okinawa. Back when America won its wars. The plane shuddered, jerked nose down, and careened toward the tragically short landing strip. Gary gritted his teeth, tasting the bourbon and club crackers that served as his breakfast after waking up mid-flight, hoping that it was already over. After a screaming descent that felt more like a free fall, the plane skipped, skidded, then thudded onto the asphalt, and wobbled toward the lone gate of the one-horse airport. The AC was cut, and Gary mopped his brow, feeling the creep of the unencumbered sun that beat down on the winged metal cylinder. This was heat without season. "Wow! Wasn't that something?" Gladys chirped, clutching Gary's leg. "What an adventure!" Gary was just hoping their baggage made it into the guts of this rattletrap during their layover in L.A., and that the rooms had central air and plenty of ice. He had vacation drinking to do. The passengers disembarked across the boiling tarmac and were met by a garishly painted golf cart that took them to the Sea Pearl Resort, where they had booked 3 nights of fun with the sun, as the confirmation agent assured him in choppy English. The room was modest and smelled musty, which he thought was odd for the dry, kiln-like conditions of a Pacific islet squatting on the equator. Gladys flopped on the bed with a laugh and paged through the faded brochures left on the nightstand. Gary set about inspecting the room, checking for faulty wiring and load-bearing beams behind the walls. This was earthquake country, and he'd be good goddamned if he'd breathe his last under a pile of cheap roofing smack dab in the lap of slanty-eyed heathenism. Satisfied that the walls would hold for the next 3 days, Gary rang down to the front desk while Gladys peeled off her Spanx and launched into a clumsy fashion show, ripping off tags and dangerously stretching new, non-breathable fabric. As she kept calling for Gary to look, he scanned the television, finding nothing but bizarre Japanese game shows and incomprehensible regional news, which seemed to be covering yet another natural disaster somewhere along the dark Indo-Chinese peninsula. Retribution for the godless socialists, Pat Robertson always said before he lost his mind and started talking about legalizing dope. Gary clicked through the channels a few more times, hoping for a different outcome, but found nothing remotely resembling ESPN or Fox News. Hell, he'd even settle for the Trinity Network just to get a little home cooking. Jesus Christ, he hissed, hoping to high heaven that they sold Tom Clancy at the gift shop. There was a knock on the door. Gary leapt up to open it, moving past Gladys, who was in the middle of asking his preference between a trim-shaper skirtini and something called a sarong. Gary opened the door and found a pineapple standing at shoulder height in front of him, decorated with a wispy mustache and mirrored sunglasses. It was the room service attendant, a huge grin etched across his wide, pockmarked face, making it seem wider and more pockmarked than Gary thought possible. Must be some strange genetic quirk, he thought. Inbreeding. he deduced with a nod of finality, as the walking botany experiment held out a red and white plastic bottle and 2 Dixie cups. Gary glared at the label. "The hell is this?" "Language, Gary," Gladys trilled from the bathroom. "Whiskey," the attendant answered with a smile before putting the bottle to his mouth, as if instructing this confused round eye what to do with it. "I asked for Jim Beam," Gary growled, taking the plastic container of black velvet and holding it out in front of him with disdain. The total lack of understanding of decent distilled spirits was worse than he feared. "Whiskey," the Wallachian repeated, handing Gary the Dixie cups, and held out his hand, palm side up. Gary looked at him with disappointment and shook his head. "It's already starting," he sighed as he dug into his pocket and pulled out some loose change, which he dropped into the man's gnarled, net-scarred hand. The attendant bobbed his head and loped away, walking in a manner more accustomed to being on the deck of a pitching skiff than solid land. Gary frowned at the shabby bottle, most likely airlifted in during the Reagan administration. Better than nothing, he surmised, and a definite necessity to survive the next half of the beachwear for the mature woman burlesque going on inside their room. When in Rome, drink low. "He kind of looked like Don Ho, didn't he?" Gladys called out from the bathroom. Gary sighed and closed the door. The sun dropped behind the island's volcanic peaks, and under the burden of jet lag and cheap bourbon, Gary was soon ready for a nap that would hopefully extend into an early bedtime. Gladys had other plans, and finished her fashion show with a grand finale, waddling out of the bathroom in an ill-fitting, matronly nightie cut from way too much shiny material. She slunk over to the bed and shook Gary awake, purring something about consummating the honeymoon. Gary knew the drill and got down to business, turning the light off while he fought through his boxers. "No," Gladys cooed. "Tonight I want us to see each other, like the natives, on the island of blue dolphins." Gary looked for his Dixie cup as her evening wear hit the floor. In their intertwined post-coital positions, the couple listened to massive waves crashing down on the beach below. "I think I felt the earth move while we were, Gladys whispered. Gary, feeling buzzed, smiled. "Yeah, I have that effect on women." She giggled. "Can you believe those waves?" Gary scratched at his jaw. "Must be high tide," he muttered, dozing off. Gladys listened as Gary began to softly snore. "We could get washed away at any moment," she said quietly, delighting in some imagined danger on this forgotten reef, thousands of miles from civilization. Now that he was asleep, she snuggled up close to Gary's thick torso and exhaled happily, running her fingers through his chest hair that always reminded her of Tom Selleck. That night, Gary dreamt that the whole world was heaving and pitching around him, then disintegrated like a sand painting into an endless, howling abyss below. But as everything melted away, Gary stood tall in the middle of nothingness, balanced on a six-fold circular pattern shimmering bright yellow below his booted feet. He looked down into the void and found a comfort in the emptiness. He paused for a second, trying to remember his waking life, then leapt off the edge. Gary fell, but didn't experience a plunging sensation. Instead, he felt himself twirling, tumbling upward amid a cloud of oily bubbles. His body softened, becoming pliable, and clove into a double helix. Even through all of this, Gary didn't try to wake up. He just watched inside his dream, as his body separated into minutiae, wondering how it would all end. The next morning, Gary awoke with a start, threw off the smothering covers, and tried to press himself back together. He couldn't remember his nightmare, which was strange. Gary was inclined to bad dreams and cursed to remember them all, filing them away in a dark vault deep inside. He'd seen a lot, in the haunted jungles of Vietnam, in his private, shameful thoughts since then. But this was different. Stark flashes came to him, yet he couldn't make heads or tails of what he actually dreamt last night. Just fractured glimpses, suffocation, choking, drowning in the sky. Gary blinked his eyes and crawled out of bed, careful not to wake Gladys, who slept with a contented smile on her face. God bless her little mind, she never dreamed. He pulled on some baggy swimming trunks and padded to the dresser, where he poured himself the last of the black velvet into his limp Dixie cup. Gary took a sip, trying to burn away the strange feeling nagging at him, and looked in the mirror, squeezing a portion of his hardened gut. Not bad, sailor. His self-examination was broken up by an unholy racket coming from outside, down by the beach, the frantic squawking of birds. He walked out onto the patio and looked down at the waterfront, where a jabbering cloud of seafowl were dive-bombing the sand. Gary reached for his flip-flops. Gary made his way down to the beach, approaching a gathered group of locals watching the feeding frenzy in silent mourning. A few shooed away birds in hopes of salvaging the fresher carcasses, but most were ruined, chewed up before they hit shore. It was the same scene up and down the beach, black sand hosting a twisting colonnade of the ocean's gleaming dead. Gary examined the heaps as the first squirm of rot began to set in. Amid the mass of dismembered commercial fish and knotted balls of kelp, he spied some very unusual creatures. He'd watched plenty of Jacques Cousteau with his oldest in the 70s, and knew that what he was looking at wasn't your usual collection of supermarket fillets. Here and there were the pulpy, many-legged remains of bizarre creatures from the darkest depths, possibly never before seen by human eyes. Whatever violence drove these things to dry land must have dredged them up from somewhere impossibly deep. Wanting a souvenir, Gary bent down to pick up a bony specimen sprouting what looked like a dozen eye stalks and feet like flippers when a hand stopped him. He looked up and found a squatty, strong-shouldered Wallachian gripping him tightly by the arm. The man shook his head and pulled him back. Irritated by this close contact, but not wanting to make a scene, Gary scowled, stood up and gave ground, while the man shook his head again and crossed his arms, continuing his silent gaze at the unhallowed funeral in front of him. Suddenly, very thirsty, Gary turned and headed back to the room and his deteriorating Dixie cup, passing a rusted front loader belching smoke into the screeching sky as it headed toward the shore. After a continental breakfast of slimy eggs and bacon ostensibly hewn from shoe leather, Gary took initiative and proposed that they go for a swim, which had the added bonus of allowing Gladys to show off her new Day One bathing costume. Hoping to gain wide berth from the aquatic holocaust that choked their side of the island, Gary and Gladys caught a scooter-drawn rickshaw to the opposite, undeveloped side of Wallachia, which, according to the desk clerk, an oddly proportioned man with puffy hair and sideburns who looked like a villain in those knockoff Bruce Lee films, boasted a secluded beach not even used by the locals. That suited Gary just fine. It had been 40 years since he swam in the ocean, and he'd be damned if some grinning native or snickering tourist saw him trip over a riptide or lose his shorts in the undertow. In a dusty trinket shack just outside of town, Gary picked up some antiquated Navy-issue snorkeling gear that must have come from a returning American brother freshly emerged from the slimy hell of Vietnam, his sanity left behind in a bloody jungle pillbox. The scooter puttered up a bumpy dirt road that meandered into the hills, affording a view of the oblong island and the never-ending water that tried to swallow it every high tide. Even with the underpinnings of black sand, the surrounding sea just beyond the breakers seemed darker than most volcanic islands in the South Pacific, hinting at an unusual depth, positioning the island of Wallachia as just the tip of a capacious ebony spear, thrust fast and hard from the sea floor. Gladys slipped her arm under Gary's, interrupting his musing. "Isn't this romantic?" she sighed. "Yeah, it's something else," he said. She rested her head on his shoulder. "I want to be buried here." Gary knew she was just caught up in the moment, but his thoughts turned to the grim-faced locals gathered on the beach, watching as his wife's swollen, naked body sank slowly to an unreachable ocean bottom. Patting her absently on the head, he surmised that Gladys wouldn't find a watery grave chewed to the bone by unclassified fish as romantic an ocean. Moving his gaze to the hills to his right, he scanned the ridgeline of the leveled-off peaks. He did the same just outside of Da Nang. The zips cut them to fucking pieces that day, raining down hot death for 18 straight hours. Ghosts of the past never rest, especially in heat like this. Just then, something not altogether natural in the shadow of the mountains caught Gary's attention. Shading his eyes from the blazing sun, he spotted a ring of tilted, worn statuary on a sloping hillside. Aside from their greenish-gray color, they looked similar to those silent monoliths found on Easter Island. But that couldn't be the case, as Easter Island was 4,000 miles away. "What are those things?" Gary asked the driver. Gladys looked around and fumbled with her camera, hoping to shoot something interesting enough to impress the gals at Sunday brunch. The driver turned around to Gary and motioned to his ears. "What are those things?" "Up there!" Gary yelled, jutting his finger at the hillside. The driver shrugged and smiled. Gladys began snapping pictures at random, not sure what Gary was talking about. "What is it, honey?" she called. The driver glanced up at the hills and made tiny movements with his hands. Gary noticed this and looked up at the worn, discolored monoliths, sneering at such superstitious nonsense. But just as they rounded a curve and were out of sight, Gary could have sworn that one of the statues looked vaguely amphibian, which would clearly make them not like the exaggeratedly human effigies carved on Easter Island. "What did you see?" Gladys asked again, checking her shots. "Nothing," Gary said, trying to convince himself by clearing his throat and swallowing. "Every place has its ghosts." Gladys set up a picnic on one of her mother's quilts atop the rocky beach, dotted with large basalt rock formations, polished smooth by endless years of determined wave and weather. It wasn't the most comfortable stretch of sand, but at least the natural bowl of the cove protected it from the fickle tide and the onslaught of dead fish that plagued the sea pearl side of the island. After a snack of venison summer sausage and Colby cheese brought from home, lubricated by a clay jug of room-temp Jap sake purchased locally, Gary stood and beat his chest, grunting like a silverback, which elicited a giggle from Gladys. He grinned and marched to the water, determined to make eye contact with this unruly foreign ocean. Gladys watched him go, trying to remember the exact year when the fullness of his backside suddenly evaporated. Gary stopped at the lapping water's edge and dipped in a toe. Not bad. Easing in, the water became surprisingly frigid just yards from the beach, much colder than he expected. Shivering, he waded out to his chest, then pushed off and began to tread water, working forgotten muscles. Gary leaned back and kicked his legs, staring up at the infinite blueness of the sky above. For just a moment, floating weightless, he felt like an infant inside an immense frigid womb of dark fluid. His dream whispered back to him. Gary smiled for a second before something long and thick slithered between his paddling feet. He froze, allowing his toes to touch sand, bringing the waterline to just below his upturned mouth. Gary tried to recall the list of sharks native to the area. He came up with nothing other than scenes from Jaws 3D, his favorite installment of the series. Gary held his breath, feeling the tightness of water around his submerged body. Nothing moved, save the gentle rise and fall of the waves. Maybe he imagined it. This island set the mind to strange things. He was just about to continue his swim when something large and powerful bumped into his lower back and stayed there, pressing against him, nuzzling. Gary thrashed his arms behind him, striking something hard and ice-cold that shot away quickly, the force of its propulsion dragging him under. He surfaced and ran with a panic stiffness to the shore. Breathing hard, he rushed from the water and jogged towards Gladys, who looked like a bell-shaped porcelain doll, lying in a stretch of black nothingness. With leaden legs, he made it to the blanket and collapsed next to his wife, who was sunbathing under a thick slathering of 50 SPF. Jesus Christ, Gary let escape between labored breaths. You almost drown again? Gladys asked without concern behind her absurd sunglasses 2 generations too large. No. She shaded her eyes and peered at him. No, he repeated, lowering his voice. I just felt something out there. The ocean is full of all sorts of things, honey, Gladys said. Remember Jonah and the whale? Gary rose to his knees and toweled off, keeping an eye on their scooter driver, who smoked and watched them underneath squinted eyes on a cliff above. Gary laid face down on the quilt, not noticing what was higher up, on the sloping hillside in the shadows of the mountains, where a collection of motionless, naked human figures stood and watched the 2 stark white visitors lay on their black beach below. From this elevated vantage point, the basalt along the shore showed clear evidence of careful cutting and shaping of massive stonework, which lay half buried in the sand. The ruined columns outlined a foundation of an immense structure, as if scattered in a fit of rage by a colossal child, in a time when the world was still young and wild. Back at their room, following a silent scooter ride from the far beach, Gary and Gladys showered together for the first time since before their grown children were born, and remarked with laughter at how shower stalls must have been more spacious in simpler times. Their intermingled feet danced over the rivulets of dark grit that collected on the tile, before slithering down the drain, joining their billion-year-old brethren under the sea. Gary found himself inside the same dream, only this time he was an amphibious creature rising from the abyss that had taken him. Higher and higher he climbed, only to be berthed onto a burnt, sandless shore recently cooled from the fires that raged and smoked on mountain tops looming in the distance 1,000 miles high. The domed sky above was copper-colored and veined with crimson gold. Triple moons, soft with youth and fat in their close orbit, jockeyed for prominence in the starless expanse of space just above. The Gary creature moved with pain, his soft bones protesting against dry gravity. He struggled for breath, feeling his neck tighten and his chest about to explode. He coughed, drew air into tiny lungs, and exhaled a roar of victory, declaring himself a prodigy. Gary awoke from his dream, coughing onto his pillow and scratching at the sides of his neck. He sat up, staring sightlessly at the wall opposite of him. But he wasn't afraid. He felt like a conqueror, looking down and noticing the bulge in his boxers. He nudged Gladys awake. In an unusually jovial mood that evening as they dressed for dinner, Gary announced that they were to dine away from the resort, finding the finest place on the island that served only the most authentic Wallachian cuisine. Gladys was as shocked as she was overjoyed. "You really mean it, Gare Bear?" she asked. "Sure do," he said. "Let's soak up a little local color, huh?" Gladys squealed and hugged him close. She rushed over to the closet. "Let's really have a safari tonight." Gary slumped onto a rattan chair, immediately regretting his generous idea as Gladys unveiled a gaudy Hawaiian shirt for him and a matching dress of the same flowery material for her. He knew it was no use arguing nor fighting it, for it had arrived. They were that couple. They'd be power walking in the local mall every morning in matching sweatsuits the day after they landed back in Omaha. Gary's mood darkened. His thoughts turned to whiskey. "You think we can find a place with a luau?" she asked. "We can pretend we're Mr. and Mrs. Ho." Ho, indeed. Cuckolded by a dead Hawaiian. Again. Gary excused himself and headed for the front desk, praying to the Christian God for the discovery of another plastic bottle of black velvet. Even this far out, no matter how hard he tried, some things would never change. They set out from the Sea Pearl an hour later. Gary walked several steps ahead of Gladys, who was taking pictures of every neon-lit tourist shop and gaudy storefront she came across. He scratched at the tag, irritating his neck inside the back of his stiff shirt, which still had that hollow, stale smell of a Taiwanese warehouse. He felt ridiculous, walking about in this loud, garish setup that strategically matched his woman's. If he had a tail, it would have been tucked deeply between his chafed legs. Gary glanced behind him at his wife's enormous purse, wondering if anyone else could hear the clanging of his testicles against her bottle of Avon perfume better suited for pest eradication. Walking alone, wrapped inside the cold, comfortable blanket of boozy gloom, Gary searched for the first place that looked presentable, just wanting to get off this strange, black-rimmed island that seemed so at odds with the rest of the civilized world. Honeymoons are for suckers. He was right the first time. Rounding a corner, Gary came across a glowing sign for the Seven Seas Grill, nestled between two large warehouses. He peered inside and saw that the joint was sparsely populated and seemed more or less clean. Good enough. Gary prepped his case and turned to find Gladys, but she was nowhere to be found. He darted his eyes up and down the cramped street, feeling an unexpected rush of fear. Gary headed back around the corner and found Gladys bent over a legless transient propped up on the curb. She handed the wrinkled old man a few dollars, rewarded with a toothless grin. Gary's face soured. He called out to her, and she trundled over. "That sweet old man just gave me the most wonderful thing." Gladys held up a spiny shell hanging from a hemp string, featuring a six-fold circular pattern, shimmering bright yellow. "Put that away," Gary said. Gladys was taken aback. "Why? It's so pretty. And that old man told me that it would protect us on the island. Isn't that neat? He didn't even have any legs." Gary scowled. "It's pagan jewelry. Neat has nothing to do with it. You think Pastor Thune would want you wearing that around town? Come on, toss it out." Pouting, Gladys walked to the nearest overflowing trash can and laid it atop the pile. Gary was distracted, his mind delving into his memory, trying to uncover his certainty about this cheap trinket. Gladys glumly rejoined Gary. "Party pooper," she mumbled. Gary pulled at his itchy shirt. "Let's go eat." Gary and Gladys were seated in a corner booth next to a murky aquarium. Cuttlefish swirled along the bottom, hiding from the sputtering light, while tiny eels slithered to and fro, taunting their older antecedents. A sea snail clung to the inside of the glass, unable to keep up with the filth, or had merely quit trying. Gladys read the menu aloud to no one in particular. Gary stared into the tank, once again remembering the death scene on the beach, remembering a tiny sliver of his dream. "So, what will it be?" The question caught Gary off guard, and he jerked his head to find a tall, darkly handsome Central Asian man that definitely didn't look local standing in front of them. Still Asian, though. Asian enough. Gary glanced at his wife, flexed the faded green anchor tattoo on his beefy forearms, and opened the menu. "What's the best thing in the house?" Gladys asked, avoiding her husband's glare. The waiter smiled broadly. "Devil fish, ma'am. Best in all the islands." Gladys's permed hair seemed to shiver with excitement. "Ooh, that sounds yummy, doesn't it, Gary shook his head, squinting at the prices on the right side of the menu. "I don't like the sound of that." "Oh, pooh," Gladys chided. "Live a little." Gary glowered and handed the menu to the waiter without looking at him. "I'll have the special." The waiter nodded and turned to Gladys, who continued scanning the menu like it was the goddamn Rosetta Stone. "You're supposed to let a lady order first," she said, as if an afterthought, but which clearly wasn't. Gary cracked his neck. "You have any whiskey here?" "No, sir," he answered coolly. "Only rum." "Oh, goody," Gladys clapped. "I'll have a Mai Tai and the devilfish." Gladys handed off the menu and smiled sweetly at her husband. A barb dipped in honey. According to Gary's Timex, the food arrived exactly 28 minutes after the waiter disappeared into the silent kitchen. Gladys was already on her third Mai Tai, served in a ceramic cup fashioned into the mouth of an exotic fish. Gary was absently rubbing his stomach that burned with sugary indigestion from 9 shots of cheap rum. "This is what you get for traveling," he ruminated dourly with a burp. The waiter set a plate in front of Gary that featured a thick, inscrutable slab of grilled marine life surrounded by seashells and a giant clutch of parsley. "What's this?" Gary demanded. "Special," the waiter assured him with a pleasant smile. "I mean, what is it?" The waiter shrugged as he set a sizzling plate of braised devilfish in front of Gladys. "Catch of the day." Gary was about to protest when his wife cut him off. "Don't complain, Gary. You get what you pay for." The waiter nodded and bowed slightly. "Bon appetit," he said in a perfectly annoying French accent as he retreated. Gary frowned at Gladys as he snapped open his napkin. "Can't you be on my side just once?" Gladys slurped up the last of her Mai Tai. "Oh, don't be silly." She held up her glass to the waiter hovering by the bar as Gary picked up his knife and fork and tucked into his meal. The skin was a bit rubbery and tough, resisting Gary's efforts. "Shark," Gary said. "I like shark." "Of course you do, dear," Gladys said, absently, receiving her fresh Mai Tai from the waiter with a suggestive smile. "Gonna need a bigger boat," Gary mumbled to himself with a chuckle as he sawed with his knife. Gladys just hummed tunelessly to herself. Finally, the plated skin parted under the blade and revealed a pinkish flesh underneath. Gary frowned, cut off a slice, and put it in his mouth. He chewed hesitantly at first, but found the flavor surprisingly agreeable. "Not bad," he said. "I guess I do get what I pay for." Gary cut off a larger hunk, smiling as he chewed. "How's Satan's ding-dong over there?" he asked, poking his knife at her plate. "Absolutely sinful," Gladys enunciated in that theatrical way that emerged when she drank in mixed company. She took another exaggerated bite while keeping a wobbly eye contact with their swarthy waiter. By the end of the night, Gary felt like he was warming up to the island. The dinner was spectacular and reasonably priced. Even the bar bill was a pittance, as their waiter seemed to have comped half the drinks poured with a heavy hand. In island hospitality, Gary reckoned. Maybe he was wrong about this place. They left the restaurant and headed back to the resort. Gladys seemed heated up, so Gary let her go on to the room, determined to comb the shops for whiskey. He only made it a few blocks before his extremities turned to jelly, and he pitched to the sandy pavement, skinning his hands and tearing the knees of his linen trousers. The heartburn had dissipated in his notoriously iron gut, but his head felt like it was packed in cotton. Worse, his heart was pounding like he had shotgunned a pot of Folgers. Sweat coated his brow, soaking through the flowers of his stiff shirt, making it feel like an exoskeleton he needed to shed. He crawled to his feet and clutched a corroded street lamp for support. He spit something thick and unnatural and looked around, trying to get his bearings. The streets were deserted, but he felt eyes on him, hundreds of them, and not all of them in pairs, peering out through grotesque pineapples from deep in the dark places, away from the isolated circles of light and the neon glow of the storefronts. One window display featured naked female mannequins, arms arranged into obscene poses, topped by hideous tribal masks. He hadn't seen this on the way home, but it was all he could see now. Distended necks and tiny breasts with nipples like fingers. Unnatural, primal postures, as suggestive as they were threatening. The vacant eyes that seemed to have depth and purpose shot their darkness deep into him, and he reeled, falling backwards without moving. He saw clouds of exploding napalm, flattened smears of green, rising triumphant into a mushrooming horror show of angry soot and burned trees and skin and innards and dreams that were no different than his own. White phosphorus melted into the ground, eating up the bones of ancestors and their buried secrets. Gary clawed at his face and blinked his eyes dry, only to see lolling tongues quiver from underneath plastic teeth and lick toward the window, tasting the glass and streaking it with blackish gore. He turned to flee the other way, when he stumbled over something lying in the gutter. At his feet was the body of the legless transient, his skin gray as if mummified, his mouth wrenched open sideways, gums crawling with insects. A final scream, or a last desperate bite. Gary careened back up the sidewalk, hoping he was heading in the right direction. Behind him, the poorly lit street narrowed, waiting. After what seemed like hours, Gary threw open the door to their room. Gladys was snoring in a rattan easy chair, dressed in a crooked grass skirt and bunched-up pink nylons, a string of puka shells balled in her hand, succumbing to the Mai Tais mid-primp. Gary collapsed to the ground, clothing soaked, heaving for breath. "I'm sick," he wheezed, trying to wake her. His voice failed. Gary slumped into the bathroom and pawed at the switch, jarring the 6 walls into painful, sudden white light. He propped himself up in front of the mirror and saw bloodshot, yellowing eyes staring back at him like a demented stranger. He bent down over the toilet bowl and held on tight. He hated vomiting, but he had to get this liquor out of him, just like when he was 12, when he took on an entire fifth of gin for his debut. He had almost died then. That was before he went pro. Maybe he had lost a step. He just had to go through this and start fresh tomorrow. Man up and do the deed, goddammit. Gary stuck his finger deep into his throat, which gurgled and contracted as his stomach prepared to empty against its will. He pushed deeper, eyes gushing tears, until his gut seized and pushed upwards. Gary leaned into the bowl, his body clenching as if shut through with a cattle prod. Paralyzed with the effort, he choked a scream into a high-pitched rasp, yet nothing but foamy saliva came out. He tried again, and only quivering drool dripped through his strangled shriek into the toilet water. He sat back, gulping air, fighting back the tremor as his body attempted to resume normal functioning. The ceiling spun, the water stains in the tiles taking on demonic shapes, goat-faced fairy folk fucking on clouds, a whale swallowing a city. Someone must have spiked his cocktails with enough LSD to melt a buffalo. The waiter, that fucking waiter, Gladys. Anger burning through his revulsion, Gary bellied up to the commode and jammed his finger down his esophagus, nearly fitting his fist inside his mouth, stretching and cracking the skin around it, jaw wrenched sideways. Crawling insects. His stomach convulsed and expelled whatever was left inside, which felt like nothing. Gary feared a night of dry heaves with a span that trapped time that never seemed to end, freezing him in panic forever. Veins bulged in his neck and forehead. Blood vessels burst in his eyes. Gary's face turned purple and the light dimmed. Finally, a dribble of black ichor dripped past his lips and dotted the water like ink. In it writhed what resembled a dying tapeworm, but it had tiny legs like a millipede. Parasite brought up from a tangle of guts. More bubbled out of him, and everything went dark. Gary woke up on the bed as Gladys was getting dressed in a high-waisted denim jumper. It was still dark outside, and the ocean sounded closer than before, right outside the patio door, underneath the ground. The sheets chafed his skin, the terrestrial cotton strands clawing at him. "Oh, there you are," she said, cheerily. "Did you feel that shaking?" "What?" Gary said, a deep body shiver stealing his words that felt rounded and unfamiliar on top of his rubbery tongue. The rest of him felt numb. He tried to move, but only quavered like a mad dog drunk drying out in an alley after a 40-year bender. "Between the walls moving and those noises you were making, scared the dickens out of me. I ran into the bathroom and found you on the floor, all frozen and stiff with a bloody mouth. I was afraid you were having an aneurysm." She laughed, but it came out shrill like a bird. He put the ball of his hand to his throbbing head. He felt worse than before. "Fuck. Language. Gary, you should have seen what was in that toilet. All sorts of weird things. She sat next to him on the bed and placed a moist hotel towel on his forehead. I think all those toxins are leaching out of your system. Must be this fresh air and organic seafood. I told you that we should start juicing. It worked for Jack LaLanne. He's dead. Well, I feel like he didn't know how to describe it. Didn't have the strength. I know you do. Rest now. You'll feel better in the morning. She bent down, removed the towel, and felt his forehead for a fever. It was clammy, cold. She paused for a second, then grabbed her purse and headed for the door. Where are you going? Just out for a walk. That fucking waiter. Be back in a jiff. The door closed behind her, and he heard her mules clatter away faster than he thought possible. Gary closed his eyes and felt 1,000 others opening up inside of him. He prayed for no dreams and knew that his mumbled pleas would fall on deaf ears. Or maybe no ears at all. Gladys hurried up the deserted sidewalk, an address written on resort stationery clutched in her hand. She peered anxiously at the street signs. Something large and low to the ground shifted back into the shadows without making a sound. She never noticed as she moved on, the lines in her face carved deeper under the sodium lights swaying on poles above. Farther up, amid the jagged shadows that marked where the mountains bit into the sky, tiny fires burned and bobbed like dancing sparks, escaping a smoldering log. She came to a set of barred windows, decorated with a wired plastic sign. The painted cross had faded from red to a pale, unpleasant pink. The bulb was turned off. Gladys banged on the bars. Hello? Someone moved inside the clinic. She banged again. Is anyone in there? My husband's sick. He doesn't... She didn't continue. Didn't know how. She heard another sound and peered through the window. A pair of wide, staring eyes looked back at her from the gloom. They were rounded and buggy, not like anything she'd seen on the island. They moved toward her without blinking or giving away what was attached to them, even as they reached the bars. Gladys stumbled backwards, falling out of one of her shoes. She left it on the sidewalk behind her and hobbled on one heel further down the street. Gary forced himself to sit up. He wanted to be awake when she came home, smelling of garlic sweat and oriental fuckery. He knew that stink all too well, from Burma to the Philippines. He'd be damned if his wife did too. He'd kill the bitch first. All of his old impulses born in piles of maggot-choked jungle corpses flowed back into him, firing his limbs and putting salt back into his spine. He stood up and strode to the dresser, taking off his clothes. He flexed in front of the mirror, muscles bulging with a youthful strength and vitality left on the college gridiron. He felt massive, transcendent. He felt like a goddamn monster. It was then that he saw the tiny black needle poke through the skin just above his unruly nest of pubic hair surrounding his erection. He stared at it, detached, as other spiky tendrils emerged from his rounded belly that swelled by the second. The room shuddered, or maybe it was his cells shouting out in protest, and the walls never moved. A low tone rumbled deep below him like the last bass note on a million-key piano, reverberating from somewhere far beneath the ground. As if breaking a spell, Gary's body sagged, and he puked up blood, holding it in his mouth under glassy, terrified eyes, and then swallowed, taking down skittering chunks that laughed at him. The island swallowed with him, stealing the air and leaving everything deathly still. The incessant sound of the crashing waves was gone, sucked back home, away from the shoreline that hated it. Jarred inside a cocoon of profound silence, Gary felt his chin dip and gore leak from his mouth, and he looked down at the spreading forest of black writhing spines sprouting from his body. In a moment of instant clarity, Gary realized that he was about to see exactly what his insides were made of. And he wasn't afraid. He was curious. Gladys was lost, But that was the least of her apprehension. The entire city suddenly seemed deserted. Even the ocean seemed to have fled, as she couldn't hear the surf, just an occasionally creaking, like her grandmother's old porch swing. It was a thick, pregnant silence, amplifying her sobs. She moved one way, then the other, wiping at her eyes, looking at the mascara that clumped on her fingertips. It was black and runny, like what she found in the toilet next to her comatose husband. She turned to run, then gasped, hope flickering in her face. Gladys kicked off her remaining shoe and ran toward the familiar restaurant. Up on the hills, far above town, thousands of people, not all of them local Wallaceans, stared down at the lone woman running through the street. Their naked flesh was decorated from toe to forehead with Polynesian tattoos of swirls and spirals, meshed with patterns far older and more ominous of teeth and eyes, twisted geometry, and forgotten glyphs. None of them moved as they watched, not even the waiter, who stood taller than the rest, his face painted yellow and green and dotted with black, his protruding eyes following Gladys below. All the signage was turned off in the window of the Seven Seas Grill, but the front door was open. Gladys ran inside and found it just as empty as the rest of the town, but there was no sign of a hasty exit. Tables were arranged neatly, chairs left on the floor, awaiting business the next day. "Hello?" she called out, startled by the sound of her own voice that seemed to echo back at her from a soft barrier. She rushed through the swinging double doors and into the overly bright, spotless kitchen that seemed to be missing most of its appliances and utensils. She looked around, not sure what to do. Out of reflex, she grabbed a butcher's knife resting on a white plastic cutting board. Gladys noticed an insulated door slightly ajar in the far corner of the room. Moving as fast as her trembling legs would take her, she followed the knife point into the walk-in refrigerator and found that it was more of a corridor lined with prepackaged and canned food. More than one would expect to find on an island surrounded by an ocean teeming with fish. She emerged into a spacious cooler the size of a small plane hangar, her feet splashing in a pool of oily water on the floor. The smell of gasoline mixed with a noxious, heavy odor that stank more like a filthy reptile house at the zoo than the docks at high tide. A generator puttered and smoked just outside a window that provided the only light, blocked by a prodigious bulk that took up most of the room, rising to the high, reinforced ceiling. At first, it looked to be a mound of dirt, or maybe a bus covered in a sprawling tarpaulin, held fast to the floor by small hillocks of melting ice. But as she moved forward, Gladys noticed a glistening quality to the shape in the low light, an almost phosphorescent glow, lined with creases and furrows. The smell was overpowering, and the water deepened the closer she crept, but she was drawn to the enormous mass. Just feet from it, she discerned deep cuts into one side of the deeply wrinkled hulk and large slabs of missing tissue, conjuring images of old whaling footage and the gashes left in the sides of great beasts by blades the size of a man. Gladys reached her hand forward, compelled to make contact with what could only be called wounds, when a shiver seemed to run across the surface of the shape. She froze, just as the colossal thing clenched and thrashed, booming against the corrugated roof. Gladys shot backwards and landed in the stinking slush. Outside, an emergency warning siren gathered itself into a scream from somewhere high and far away. "Oh my God!" Gary moved to the bed, his legs somehow still working, but disjointed and jerky the way a marionette flails under the control of an inartful puppeteer. He lay back slowly onto the comforter, his skin bubbling like a latex balloon stuffed with beetles. The siren was blaring outside, then wound down to a long, extended murmur. Gary wasn't breathing, just waiting with something resembling a smile pitched under his bloated face. He felt the sudden urge to roar, and did, just as his body imploded, falling in on itself as a mass of writhing creatures emerged from what was once him to feast on what was left, on each other, Gladys ran, like she hadn't since childhood, her arms flailing and breath caught in her chest. She moved on instinct, barreling onto a side street that angled downward, taking her to the seashore. Looking up at the beach, she spotting the resort with a scream of joy, when her attention was caught by the sinking expanse of pitch-black sand stretching out to her left, dropping out of sight where the water once was. The ocean was gone, exposing the lip of the island and nothingness beyond. She was suddenly standing on a box butte in central Nebraska, like the ones she and Gary marveled at outside of Salt Creek on their way to Denver as the pink sun faded to dusk and the prairie yawned like a brown abyss below. Gladys flung open the door to their room at the Sea Pearl and found the wall facing the sea eaten away. A trail of blood and debris led down to the ocean. She ran to the patio and saw a twisting mass slink toward the waterless beach, expanding as it went, moving from what looked like a pool of slime to actual shapes, growing erect, evolving with every quivering second, worming toward the shadow that was forming high in front of it. Gladys gaped up at the towering bulwark of water bearing down on the island. It was a mile out, and what looked like a mile high, and it made no sound. It didn't have to. She turned and walked back into the room, lying in the blood and black-soaked bed, resting her head next to the desiccated eggshell skull that once belonged to her husband, who broke the mold and decided to take her on the honeymoon she always wanted. Gladys smoothed out the denim of her outfit and folded her hands over her stomach. She tried to pray, but forgot the words.